Philip, for that lovely introduction. I've brought a box of Philip Lashton books and Miles Evergood books, and that will tell you why my great-grandparents, how they came here by mistake. Please feel free to help yourself if you would like copies. So it's an unanticipated delight to talk again to an audience at a second launch of Pomegranates. It's been 33 years, a generation since its first iteration. It was initiated as Peter said, by the Jewish Board of Deputies in 1987. They wanted to commemorate the bicentenary with something that would endure longer than the concert and the art show. And they looked around for who could do it, and Nancy Keesing, AO, suggested me. Many of us will remember her, what a marvellous person she was. And I had just published to some acclaim Philip Lashton, and she herself was a renowned author and poet. She'd been chairperson of the Literature Board of the Australia Council and a board member of the Australian Society of Authors as editor of their journal. So you can imagine I felt pretty honoured. For 6 months, I spent much of my life in the Mitchell Library, the Archive of Australian Judaica, and the Fisher Library at Sydney U. Serge Lieberman and Joy Young's new bibliography of Australian Judaica had just been published and was the most marvellous resource. As well, there were advertisements in the Jewish newspapers for writers to submit. And I asked everyone I knew if they knew any Jewish writers or sources of Jewish writing. The result was a forest of photocopies, a telephone book of contacts, and not much sleep. Then came the agony of selection. My Millennium editor's smartness and experience informed me that the book would take on its own life once I knew what I wanted in it. And she was right. Last month, the North Shore Synagogue Book Club used Pomegranates for their reading. They invited me to talk about how I made the decisions for the inclusions. A few asked me why it was not online to give it greater access. Professor Bettina Cass, who launched the book in 1988, was in that audience last month and was to be here today. Something must have held her up because she cares. She said to me, Peter Phillipson is your man. If anybody can get this happening, he will. And look, he has. There is a curious parallel in the speed with which the original was produced and the speed of this online edition. That was a huge learning curve for me. After the medium changes, uninvited typos like burrs in the furs of an animal must be found one by one and removed. A very 21st century problem. There was no generally available internet in 1988. How far we have come. So how did I select? I looked for an expression of sensitivity and feeling with Jews and the Jewish experience. I also wanted to feel a touch of the writer's passion. Not every contributor is Jewish. Not all of those who are Jewish wrote about being Jewish. I used letters, diaries, journals, poems, short stories, and extracts from novels. Several had never been published before. I looked at the Jewish migrants' early struggles with language, with racism, with poverty, with climate. For the Europeans especially, there were also issues of social mores and behaviour and dress. Many of those problems had been known in some way to the writers, But they were exacerbated here because of the addition of dislocation and isolation. Through the literature, I followed over 10 decades the development and maturation of a community and a country. We can notice the change as reflected in tone and language and subject matter. Looking at the whole book today as I reread each piece, I wondered if I would choose the same ones again. Pomegranates, as it stands, is a snapshot of where Jews in Australia who wrote were up to by 1988. I stand by my selection as far as quality goes. Some of the pieces are superficial. Some may seem trite. I do still believe they are all worthy and indicate degrees of passion and identity with Jewish values. The humour in Mordechai Macabre is really dated, but in the 1920s it went to 4 editions. Racy Schlank has 3 poems included because she is witty, with a satirical humour about serious current events, which I think is a Jewish trait. Pomegranate's first entry from Moritz Michaelis is quite long. Did I really think it all needed to be included? He arrived here in 1853 and published it privately as a memoir in 1899. As a historian, I found it engrossing. Multilingual Michaelis and his new wife were the only Jews on board the sailing ship that left for Melbourne from England. His first-person account vividly describes a collision at sea. It includes their accommodation, the unfathomably irresponsible second mate socialising while on bridge duty, the other ship's horrific damage on a clear night, and the criminal loss of a young midshipman, and the volume of sea traffic around at the time. I included the same journey, fictionalised 90 years later by Hertzbergner, on a tramp steamer with so many dislocated and disoriented Holocaust-surviving Jews on board. And then, 10 years later, Serge Lieberman's memories of his voyage as a child. Michaelis' account of their arrival in 1853 Melbourne described walking from the city into the city from the wharf instead of paying the exorbitant 5 shillings demanded by the horse cab driver. He remembered their seeking almost impossible accommodation for women and surviving overwhelming heat and dust storms. Remember, this is the beginning of the gold rush in Melbourne. This contrasted with Serge Lieberman's 1951 arrival in the same city, being met by Jewish welfare and taken to a single room in Carlton. In fact, the Michaelises had fared little better in 1853 Richmond. They were fearful of violence in the streets. Lieberman experienced it in the form of anti-Semitism by the locals. Threads like these, following through 2 and more sections of the book, I felt gave it strength and verisimilitude. The young Jean Holtner and her sister in 1939 were suddenly stopped from going to school because of an epidemic. Do you know what it was? Infantile paralysis. Today, I see the parallels with our epidemic of COVID and their responses 84 years ago. That included not having masks as we do, but stuffing their noses with cotton wool. Nathan Spielbergel, David Martin, and Nancy Keesing each gave an abbreviated history of the Jewish people as a poem, but so very differently expressed. There are 2 I found painful second-generation Holocaust survivor short stories that gave me pause before I included them. In 1988, there were few second-generation writers. Maurice Lurie writes about his father. Lily Brett writes about her mother. Surviving parents brought their emotional baggage to their descendants. Today we have become aware of fourth and fifth generation carriers of the scars. I was anxious to give encouragement for young people to have their works appear in a book. I hoped that they would be inspired to keep writing. These were sourced from people I knew or who had responded to the Jewish paper's advertisements. The youngest writer included was 11 when she wrote two short stories for her school magazine about her early school days in country New South Wales. Joe Sertage and John Sandler were in Year 11 at Mount Scopus when they wrote poems for a small duplicated book created by their teacher and my colleague, Frank Rogan. Kim Baker writes so powerfully about being a Holocaust descendant, surviving descendant. She says, "I'm Australian. I only sleep in the nightmare. The tattoo glares from the fabric dealer's arm at the market." Michelle Neyman writes as a newcomer. Another poem. "There is a mournful warning knell some children of immigrants tell. A heart's confused magnetic pole. I know I'm Russian in my soul." Another thread is the insular, unsympathetic attitude of the local Jewish community to the Holocaust refugees. It is succinctly expressed as fiction in June Factor's The Wedding and Alan Collins' The Trouble with Mariana. I was asked why so many of the entries come from Victoria. The easy answer is that from the gold rush onwards, there have always been more Jews in Victoria. The title Pomegranates. They are native to the Middle East and North Africa. They are one of the Shelaminim, the 7 agricultural species the Bible gives as being symbolic of the land of Israel. They have a luxurious juice in each fruit, produced from a great number of arils or seeds. Their shape is beautiful enough to be used as Jewish religious decorations, including for the high priest's tunic and the parrot hat or curtains before the arks in synagogues. They grow as exotics in Australia, have taken root and have thrived in this climate. I saw parallels with the arrival of a different exotic community here, how we have become established and have thrived. We are like the pomegranates. In my verbal acknowledgements now, I must first thank the North Shore Synagogue Book Club. Their use of pomegranates in their November meeting generated the question, why isn't it available electronically? Bettina Cass, who has shepherded the book at each turn, was the person who suggested I speak with Peter Phillipson about digitisation access. His energy and patience are a wonder to experience. Because of it, this process from start to finish happened within 1 month. Thank you, Peter. To my family and friends who are loyally with me here today, and to Philip Moses and the Historical Society, I give a very loud thank you. I understand that as from now, Pomegranates is freely available on the website, the Historical Society website under publications, is that correct? I do hope you will enjoy it.